In the year 1867, a boy was born who defied every law of nature and every explanation science could offer. This is the chilling, forgotten story of Timothy Caldwell. In the spring of 1867, the small riverside town of Ashcombe was just beginning to stir from the long, frost-bound grip of winter. The muddy banks of the Thames glistened under a weak sun, and the chimneys of narrow brick houses smoked lazily, carrying the smell of peat and damp wood across cobbled lanes. It was a time when the marvels of science were seeping steadily into daily life. Telegraph lines were strung like taut black strings over rooftops. Newspapers carried breathless reports of new mechanical wonders, and physicians spoke confidently of the body as a machine, one they were rapidly learning to master and repair. The world was tilting toward an age where almost everything, it seemed, could be explained if only you applied enough reason and observation. Yet in that same year, in the back bedroom of a modest home on Chancery Row, something occurred that unsettled this growing sense of certainty. Timothy Caldwell was born on a drizzly April night, the first child of Margaret and Henry Caldwell, who had been married for nearly 6 years without any sign of a family. Margaret's pregnancy itself had been considered unlikely. She was 37, an age at which most country doctors of the time quietly suggested that a woman's chances of bearing children had diminished to nearly nothing. Yet she had carried Timothy without a single day of sickness, without the swelling or fatigue other expectant mothers knew all too well. Some neighbors, noticing how she walked about briskly even in her 9th month, assumed the child would be small or frail, a fragile thing not likely to last the year. They could not have been more wrong. The midwife, Mrs. Platt, a wiry woman with years of experience and a brusque manner, would later confess in guarded tones that she had never seen a birth quite like it. There had been no long hours of labor, no cries of pain echoing down the stairwell. Margaret had called for her only when the time was clearly at hand, and before Mrs. Platt could unpack her leather satchel of instruments, Timothy was already there, silent but wide-eyed, his gaze fixed in an unsettlingly steady way on the flickering candlelight. "He looked right at me," Mrs. Platt told her sister in a letter she never intended for public eyes, "as if he knew me, as if he knew everything, though he had not yet taken a single breath." She added, almost as an afterthought, that he did not cry when the cord was cut, nor when he was washed, nor when the cool night air touched his bare skin. Instead, he merely blinked, turned his head slowly toward the window, and continued to look. Henry Caldwell, a bookkeeper with a fondness for meticulous records, noted in his journal that Timothy's skin was strangely unblemished, without the ruddy blotches or bluish casts so common in newborns. His pulse was strong, steady, his breathing faint but unwavering. The boy's weight was more than respectable, just over 8 pounds, and yet he felt unusually light in the arms, as if his bones were made of some finer, less burdensome material. These were not the kind of observations Henry shared outside the family. Ashcombe was a town where oddities were often met with whispers, and whispers could too easily sour into suspicion. What little word did slip beyond the Caldwells' home traveled swiftly. The grocer's wife heard from the laundress that the child had been born without a sound and that his eyes were the color of old coins. A delivery boy claimed he'd overheard Mrs. Platt telling the doctor that the baby's heartbeat was unlike any she'd known, slower, but somehow stronger, as though it could outlast the world itself. Such tales were embroidered with each telling until they became half-remembered curiosities, the kind people recounted to fill the silence over mugs of ale. In those first days, physicians came not out of necessity, but curiosity. Dr. Edwin Price, who prided himself on his lectures at the Royal Society, visited under the pretext of checking Margaret's recovery. In truth, he wanted to see the boy for himself. Price examined Timothy with practiced detachment, pressing gently at the skull's soft spots, listening to the lungs, tapping along the spine. He found nothing that would suggest illness or deformity, yet the experience left him with a faint sense of disquiet he could not name. The infant's gaze, steady and unblinking, seemed to follow his movements with a precision no newborn should possess. Later in his private notes, Price wrote only, "No diagnosis possible. Healthy, but unusual. Will observe developments." The Caldwells themselves were caught between pride and unease. Margaret felt a fierce, protective love for her son. Yet there were moments in the quiet hours of the night when she would hold him against her and feel as though she were cradling something not entirely of her. Henry, ever the rationalist, dismissed such feelings as the product of fatigue and the overactive imagination of a new mother. Still, even he found himself lingering at the cradle, watching Timothy sleep with a stillness so complete it resembled a statue more than a living child. Life in Ashcombe resumed its slow rhythm. Barges drifted along the river, and factory whistles punctuated the day. Yet in the Caldwell household there was always the awareness, never spoken aloud, that Timothy was not like other infants. He rarely cried, fed without fuss, and seemed to track the movements of people in the room with an attentiveness far beyond his months. Margaret sometimes caught him watching the pendulum clock, eyes following its arc as if measuring time itself. Visitors who noticed such behavior would laugh nervously, then change the subject. In 1867, science was already flexing its muscles. Darwin's theories were being debated in drawing rooms and lecture halls. The telegraph was shrinking the world, and advances in medicine promised to banish many of the old afflictions. Confidence was high, and the idea that any physical or mental peculiarity could remain beyond explanation was increasingly unfashionable. Yet Timothy's arrival, with its odd circumstances and subtle but undeniable differences, reminded those who knew of it that not all mysteries bowed to human understanding. The doctors could measure his pulse, weigh his body, chart his growth, and still fail to capture the essence of what made him so different. The birth records of Ashcombe list him plainly. Timothy Henry Caldwell, born April 14th, 1867, healthy male. There is nothing in that neat script to suggest the unease in the midwife's eyes, the careful curiosity of the physicians, or the quiet unspoken understanding between Margaret and Henry that their son's life would not follow an ordinary path. To anyone reading the record decades later, it would seem unremarkable. But those who were there knew better. The child's first appearance in the world had carried with it an atmosphere, a kind of weightless gravity, impossible to name, yet impossible to forget. It was perhaps fitting that his life began in a year balanced so precariously between the old and the new, between the lingering shadows of superstition and the bright, insistent light of reason. For in Timothy Caldwell, both seemed to reside, and neither could claim him entirely. And so, from the moment of his birth, science had met a puzzle it could not solve. From his first weeks of life, it was clear that Timothy Caldwell did not conform to the quiet progression of infancy that every mother, midwife, and doctor expected. At first, his parents thought little of it. He was healthy, slept soundly, and rarely fussed. But in the same way one notices that a clock is running just a little faster or slower than it should, those around him began to sense that something about the boy was subtly, persistently out of step with the ordinary. The anomalies were not dramatic, but they were undeniable, and the more closely they were examined, the more they refused to be fitted into any familiar medical framework. Most infants at a month old can hardly lift their heads. their movements awkward and uncoordinated. But Timothy seemed to possess a strange economy of motion. When he turned his head, it was deliberate, as though he had weighed the necessity of the act before doing it. There was no flailing, no half-random twitching of limbs. His hands would close around his mother's finger with a grip that was not just strong, but sustained, as if he could hold on indefinitely, without tiring. Margaret noticed that he could lie perfectly still for long stretches, his breathing shallow yet steady, and when he did move, his actions seemed purposeful. The midwife, who visited occasionally in those early months, muttered about an old soul and kept her thoughts to herself. By the time he was 6 months old, Timothy's peculiarities had begun to attract a quiet network of observers. The local physician, Dr. Price, still found no signs of illness or abnormality, yet he began keeping more detailed notes. He recorded the boy's temperature, pulse, and reflexes with scientific precision. Everything appeared normal on the surface, save for the pulse. Instead of the quick, fluttering heartbeat expected of an infant, Timothy's was measured and slow, more akin to that of a healthy adult at rest. It was not sluggish, not weak. On the contrary, it beat with a kind of patient regularity that made Price check his watch twice. No distress, he wrote. If anything, too calm. It wasn't just his physiology that puzzled those who encountered him. It was his way of seeing. Newborns, doctors assured, could not focus their eyes for long and certainly not track moving objects with precision. Yet Timothy seemed to do both from an age when it should have been impossible. If a candle was moved across the room, his eyes would follow it without hesitation, his gaze fixed as though he were studying not merely the flame, but something beyond it. More than one visitor reported the uncanny sensation that the child was not just looking at them, but through them, as though weighing their presence in some private way. At night, Margaret sometimes woke to find him lying awake in his cradle, perfectly silent, his eyes open in the dim light. He did not cry for attention, nor did he fuss until she picked him up. Instead, he seemed content simply to watch. "He's thinking," she whispered once to her husband, though she could not say what about. Henry, ever skeptical, dismissed it as maternal fancy, but even he admitted that Timothy's alertness was unusual. As he grew, the boy demonstrated other peculiarities. His skin, pale but unblemished, never seemed to bruise in the ordinary way. When he fell, once, while trying to stand at just 8 months, there was no mark, no swelling, no tender spot to betray the tumble. His immune health was equally baffling. In a year when a bout of influenza swept through Ashcombe, touching almost every household, Timothy remained untouched, his appetite and spirits unchanged. The Caldwells took this as a blessing, though Dr. Price noted it with a mixture of relief and unease. Resilience was one thing. This was something else entirely. By the time Timothy was a toddler, his peculiarities had become an open secret in the small circle of those who paid attention. The boy rarely displayed the clumsy exuberance of other children of his age. He moved deliberately, handled objects with a strange care, and seldom babbled or cried. When he spoke his first words, they came not as isolated syllables, but in a complete, measured phrase. "It is cold." His parents stared at each other in silence after hearing it, unsure whether to feel pride or dread. The medical community, such as it existed in that provincial corner of England, could only speculate. Some suggested that perhaps he was simply advanced for his age, a prodigy of some kind. Others whispered more eccentric theories, drawing on a mixture of emerging scientific thought and older, half-forgotten folklore. But the prevailing reality was this: no established diagnosis fit Timothy. Every measurable aspect of his health suggested normalcy, even exceptional health. Yet he consistently behaved and developed in ways that broke the pattern doctors used to define childhood. There was one incident when he was barely 3 that Henry never spoke of, outside the family. During a visit to a relative's farm, Timothy wandered into the stable, where a skittish mare had been known to kick at anyone who approached her from behind. When Henry found him, the boy was standing directly at her flank, one small hand resting against her haunch. The mare stood perfectly still, her head turned slightly toward him, eyes soft, as though the two shared an unspoken understanding. When Henry reached for his son, the animal flicked her tail and returned to eating, undisturbed. It was nothing, perhaps, just a coincidence, but it unsettled him more than he cared to admit. Attempts to capture his differences on paper failed. Dr. Price tried more than once to design simple tests, asking the boy to pick out shapes, to follow moving objects, to respond to sounds at varying distances. Timothy complied without hesitation, passing each test with quiet competence. But the results gave no explanation. They revealed only that his sensory perceptions seemed unusually sharp, and that his responses, even at a very young age, were controlled and precise in a way that defied normal developmental timelines. Margaret began to dread the attention he drew, fearing it might grow into unwanted scrutiny. She avoided bringing him to public gatherings where his quiet composure would stand out among the noisy chaos of other children. Still, word spread in muted tones about the boy who never fell ill, whose eyes seemed too knowing, whose manner was neither shy nor bold, but something altogether different. The more science attempted to pin him down, the more it failed. In an age when the medical profession was beginning to believe it could illuminate every corner of human life with the clear light of reason, Timothy was like a shadow that resisted definition. There were no symptoms to treat, no ailment to correct, yet there was also no precedent for what he was. Each anomaly on its own might have been dismissed as harmless variation, but together they formed a picture that was beyond the grasp of the era's knowledge. In the quiet of the Caldwell home, life went on. Margaret read to him by lamplight. Henry recorded his growth in his neat ledger, and Timothy continued to thrive in his own inexplicable way. To the outside world, he was simply a healthy child, perhaps a touch unusual. To those who looked closer, he was a contradiction, a living challenge to the idea that every human being could be understood entirely through the lens of science. And it was in this contradiction that the real mystery began to take root. By the time Timothy was old enough to toddle unassisted through the narrow hallways of the Caldwell home, his strangeness had become more difficult to overlook. The quiet anomalies of his infancy, the steady heartbeat, the unflinching gaze, the deliberate movements, had not faded as he grew, but rather had taken on new and sometimes startling expressions. Childhood, for most, is a series of small stumbles and noisy bursts, a parade of scraped knees and shouted demands. But Timothy moved through it with an odd composure that seemed to disarm those around him. In place of the impulsive chaos of other children, he displayed a peculiar blend of restraint and awareness, as though he were taking careful note of the world before deciding how to engage with it. Margaret, though fiercely protective, was not blind to the way people watched him. When she took him to the market, she could feel the eyes of the grocer's wife, tracking his slow, measured steps between stalls. He did not pull at her skirts or point greedily at sweets. Instead, he examined each display as though weighing its worth before turning away. On more than one occasion, she caught an older woman murmuring to another about that Caldwell boy who never cried and never seemed in a hurry. It was not open mockery. Ashcombe was too polite for that. But there was a note of curiosity and sometimes unease that followed wherever they went. Within the family, this growing awareness became a subject too delicate to discuss openly. Henry noted in his ledger that Timothy's vocabulary expanded rapidly between the ages of 2 and 4, yet the boy rarely spoke unless directly addressed. When he did, his sentences were complete and considered, lacking the halting trial and error of most children learning language. There were no lisped repetitions, no garbled syllables. It was as though each word had been rehearsed in silence before being allowed into the air. Doctors came less frequently now, but when they did, they always left with that faint crease of puzzlement between their brows. Dr. Price, who had examined Timothy since birth, began to notice subtler traits. The way the boy could remember, in perfect sequence, the placement of objects in a room he had only entered once. The way he seemed to hear conversations from the far end of the hall, turning his head slightly as though absorbing every syllable. These were not skills one could easily measure with the tools of the time, and so Price wrote them down in the margins of his notes, alongside question marks that had begun to outnumber his definitive statements. At play, if it could be called that, Timothy was no less unusual. While other boys in the neighborhood threw themselves into raucous games of chase or marbles, he often stood apart, watching with that same steady, unblinking attention. When coaxed to join, he participated without awkwardness, yet without the competitive energy that made children of that age shriek with triumph or sulk in defeat. If he lost, he simply acknowledged it, with a small nod and stepped back. If he won, he accepted the result without a smile or boast. His detachment unsettled some parents, who whispered to Margaret that perhaps he needed more spirit. She would only smile tightly and say he is spirited enough for himself. One autumn afternoon, a neighbor's son tripped while running along the green, scraping his knee badly. Before the adults could reach him, Timothy had already knelt beside the crying boy, placing a small hand gently but firmly over the wound. Witnesses swore later that the injured child stopped crying almost immediately, though whether from comfort or surprise was never determined. Margaret led Timothy away before questions could begin, but she could feel the murmurs behind her as they walked home. The quiet scrutiny of adults was mirrored by the puzzled curiosity of his peers. Some children avoided him, unsure what to make of his stillness and his measured way of speaking. Others were drawn to him, despite themselves, perhaps sensing in him a kind of calm that made them feel safe. Timothy never sought to lead, but somehow small groups of children ended up orbiting him, mirroring his pace without realizing it. It was an odd phenomenon, one that Margaret noticed from the kitchen window on more than one occasion. Within the Caldwell household, life adapted around him. Henry grew used to finding his son standing silently in doorways, listening before entering a room, or sitting with a book open in his lap long before he could truly read the words. Margaret learned that if Timothy asked a question, it was never idle. Each one was deliberate, often about matters she had assumed were beyond a child's interest. "Why do clocks tick at the same pace?" he asked once, his small brow furrowed. Another time, "Why do people's eyes change when they are sad?" She did her best to answer, though she often had the sense that he was not seeking information so much as testing her own understanding. It was around his 5th birthday that the attention from outside the home began to shift from passing curiosity to quiet investigation. Dr. Price brought a colleague from London under the guise of a social visit, though his interest in Timothy was plain. The two men spent an afternoon observing him from a distance, noting the steadiness of his posture, the precision of his hand movements as he built a small tower of blocks without a single piece tipping. When they finally approached him, their questions were gentle but pointed, asking him to recall the order of items shown only briefly, or to listen to a faint sound and describe it. Each time, Timothy responded with an accuracy that left them exchanging glances. They left without offering any conclusions, though Margaret overheard one murmur to the other that the case bears watching. If Timothy noticed the scrutiny, he gave no sign. He went on with his quiet routines, rising early without complaint, eating modestly, and engaging with the world as though each moment were to be studied rather than rushed through. And yet, despite this composure, there was no sense of coldness in him. When his mother's hands were tired from kneading bread, he would rest his small palm against hers, as though lending her some of his strength. When his father came home late and weary, Timothy would meet him at the door with a simple, "You are tired," before fetching the chair by the fire. These gestures were small, but they carried a weight that Margaret and Henry felt deeply. Still, the feeling that their son's life was being observed, sometimes openly, sometimes from the shadows, never quite faded. A few neighbors had begun to ask more probing questions, and Margaret deflected them as best she could. She understood, though, that such attention was not likely to diminish. Children like Timothy, even without seeking it, had a way of drawing notice. Whether it was admiration, suspicion, or something in between, it was there all the same. In a time when medical men spoke confidently of their ability to categorize and predict human development, Timothy's very existence seemed to stand as a quiet refusal. He was healthy, yes, but not in the way they understood health. Intelligent, yes, but not in a way they could measure. And as he moved through those early years, watched by curious adults and wary children alike, it became clear that whatever defined him lay beyond the neat borders of any known science. The whispers began almost before Timothy could walk. In the small township where news traveled faster than the horse-drawn mail coach, the sight of a boy who never seemed to take ill and who could spend hours outdoors in winter without shivering quickly became a matter of fascination. People noticed things, small at first, how he would stand barefoot in the frost, gazing at the woods as if listening to something far away, how he could catch the faintest sound like the creak of a barn door half a mile off. These observations began as casual remarks over market stalls and Sunday pews, but they took on a life of their own, growing in the telling. By the time Timothy was 5, no one in town could claim not to have heard some version of the Caldwell boys' oddities. For his parents, Jonathan and Margaret, this constant undercurrent of attention was a burden they had never sought. Jonathan, a carpenter, was a man who preferred the honest tangibility of wooden tools to the slippery nature of rumor. Margaret, a quiet woman with a deep sense of privacy, felt each speculative glance like a splinter. They tried at first to carry on as though nothing were unusual. Timothy attended the small schoolhouse with other children, walked with his mother to the grocer, accompanied his father to the smithy. But even in those ordinary settings, the scrutiny followed. If Timothy climbed too high in a tree, someone would remark on his fearlessness. If he tripped and scraped a knee, someone else would comment how quickly the wound seemed to close. These observations weren't always voiced unkindly, but they fed a quiet, persistent narrative that the boy was not entirely like other boys. Some townsfolk found his differences charming in an almost folkloric way. An elderly seamstress liked to tell children that Timothy was part wind, which explained why he could run so fast without tiring. Others were less charitable. A few muttered about omens, about God marking some people for a purpose not meant to be known by man. In a community where church was the center of moral life, being set apart, even by admiration, carried a risk. Admiration could tip into fear, and fear into suspicion. Jonathan sensed it long before any open hostility emerged. He knew the way people's minds worked when faced with the unexplainable. So the Caldwells began to shield Timothy in small, deliberate ways.
Margaret asked him not to linger alone in public places, not because she feared harm, but because she feared the stories that might arise. Jonathan discouraged visits from curious neighbors who arrived with polite smiles, but too many questions. When a traveling physician heard of Timothy and asked permission to examine him, Jonathan declined outright, citing the boy's shyness. That refusal sparked fresh talk. Why wouldn't the family allow a learned man to see for himself? The more they tried to protect Timothy's privacy, the more the mystery seemed to deepen in the minds of others. Timothy himself seemed half aware of the attention. He was not a boastful child, nor particularly withdrawn. He would answer questions when asked, but rarely volunteered information about himself. When children at school dared him to prove his unusual abilities, run farther, jump higher, hold his breath longer, he complied without malice, as though he saw it as a game rather than a challenge. But Margaret noticed how afterward he would sometimes sit quietly, watching the others play as though sensing some invisible boundary between him and the rest. That awareness was perhaps the most troubling thing of all to his parents. Not that he was different, but that he was beginning to understand. He was seen as different. By the time he was 8, the whispers had matured into well-worn stories told in kitchens and at the general store. Some claimed he had been found as an infant on the riverbank after a great storm, though Margaret had birthed him in her own bed, with a midwife present. Others said he could predict the weather by scent alone. A few insisted he had never once been seen to cry. None of these things were precisely true, but they were rooted in fragments of reality, moments observed, exaggerated and reshaped. In a time when printed newspapers rarely carried more than regional news, such local tales became a form of entertainment, a way to give shape to the monotony of rural life. The Caldwells learned to navigate these currents cautiously. When church sermons turned toward the topic of divine mysteries, Margaret would keep her eyes fixed on the hymn book, unwilling to meet the glances she sometimes felt on her. Jonathan took to leaving town quickly after services, avoiding the idle conversations that often led to pointed remarks. It wasn't hostility they feared most. It was the slow, creeping weight of being defined entirely by one aspect of their lives. They wanted Timothy to grow into himself without the shadow of constant speculation. Yet there were moments when the attention turned almost protective. During one harsh winter, when a fever swept through several households, some neighbors quietly expressed relief that Timothy seemed immune, as though his strength somehow benefited the community, simply by existing. One farmer, whose own son had been laid up for a week, brought the boy a small carved whistle for good luck. These gestures softened the edges of the gossip but did not erase it. If anything, they reinforced the notion that Timothy was a figure apart, someone to be watched, discussed, and, depending on one's view, either marveled at or regarded with caution. Margaret sometimes wondered if it might have been easier to move away, to start fresh in a place where no one knew their son's early years. But Jonathan resisted the idea. Their roots were deep in that soil. Their families lay in the churchyard. And besides, he argued, wherever they went, Timothy would still be Timothy. New eyes would see the same things. New whispers would grow. It was not the town that made him unusual. It was simply who he was. Better perhaps to face the familiar gossip of neighbors than to navigate the unpredictable reactions of strangers. The boy himself seemed, for the most part, untroubled by what swirled around him. He had a keen curiosity about the natural world, spending hours observing insects, tracing the paths of birds in flight, or sitting quietly by the riverbank. He spoke little of the talk he must have overheard, but there were small signs he understood more than he let on. Once, after overhearing a group of men speculate about his constitution, he asked Margaret whether there was something wrong with him. She answered as simply as she could. that different was not the same as wrong, and that sometimes people talk because they do not understand. He seemed satisfied with this, though she noticed he became more reserved in public afterward, as though storing his truest self for the safety of home. Over the years, the intensity of the whispers ebbed and flowed. New events in town, a fire, a marriage, a scandal, would temporarily push Timothy from the center of conversation, but inevitably something would happen to draw attention back. Perhaps he would rescue a younger child from falling into the mill pond, or carry a heavy sack of grain farther than anyone expected of a boy his size. These incidents, innocent in themselves, always seemed to confirm in the minds of others that the Caldwell boy was touched by something beyond the ordinary. The Caldwells knew they could not stop people from drawing their own conclusions. All they could do was continue to guard his privacy, nurture his kindness, and hope that time would allow him to step into his own life without being entirely defined by the mystery that seemed to follow him. And so the whispers never truly stopped. They simply became part of the air the family breathed, a constant low hum in the background of their days. The men who first examined Timothy were not charlatans or backwoods meddlers. They were educated physicians, some of them trained in the great medical schools of Boston and Philadelphia, others self-taught, but with years of practical knowledge earned in battlefield hospitals and rural sick rooms. They had seen a wide span of human afflictions and anomalies, children born with rare deformities, survivors of injuries that should have been fatal, patients whose constitutions defied their prognoses. Yet when confronted with Timothy, they found themselves entering unfamiliar territory. The boy did not present as ill, nor even particularly unusual in appearance. His height, weight, and general growth fell well within expected measures. His skin bore no strange markings. His eyes were clear, his speech and motor skills in step with his peers. The mystery lay in subtler qualities, those things a chart could not easily capture: the speed at which he recovered from injury, his unusual resistance to illness, and the almost uncanny precision of his senses. The first formal examination came when Timothy was 9. A respected physician from a nearby city, Dr. Elias Prentice, was persuaded to visit after hearing repeated accounts from the townsfolk. Dr. Prentice approached the matter with the sober curiosity of a man who believed every mystery could be resolved with sufficient observation and reason. He brought with him an assortment of instruments: a thermometer, a stethoscope, a set of reflex hammers, even a primitive device for measuring grip strength. He took notes in a neat hand as he asked the boy to walk, to balance on one leg, to respond to quiet sounds. He pricked Timothy's finger to examine a drop of blood under a magnifying lens, measured his pulse before and after a short run, and tested his reactions with both sudden noises and gentle touches. In every instance, Timothy responded not merely within the range of normal, but often above average, faster, steadier, more resilient. When the examination was over, Dr. Prentice retired to the parlor with Jonathan and Margaret. He spoke kindly, but his report was little more than a restatement of the mystery. The boy is in exceptional health, he said, and his faculties are unusually sharp. I find no evidence of disease or structural abnormality. I can only say that his constitution appears remarkable. Why that should be so, I cannot yet say. He suggested a series of follow-up examinations over the coming years, but Jonathan, wary of turning his son into a specimen, declined. The doctor, though disappointed, respected the decision and left without pressing further. His departure, however, only fueled the town's speculation. If a learned man could not explain Timothy, what did that mean? Over the years, other attempts at explanation followed, some more formal than others. a traveling lecture on the wonders of the human body, heard of Timothy during a stop in a nearby town and offered to pay for the privilege of examining him before an audience. Jonathan refused outright. A local herbalist convinced Timothy's health was due to some rare mineral content in the well water near the Caldwell home, visited under the guise of delivering remedies, but spent most of her time peering at Timothy as if she could read answers from his face. Even the town's aging pastor, who had baptized Timothy as an infant, quietly admitted to Jonathan one evening that he was troubled by the boy's constitution, not in fear, but in the sense that it seemed to defy the notion that all men were subject to the same frailties. The difficulty for those who tried to study Timothy lay not only in the lack of visible symptoms, but in the limits of the science of the day. In 1867 and the years that followed, medical knowledge was expanding rapidly, but it was still rooted in observation and correlation more than in molecular understanding. Germ theory was still meeting resistance in some circles. The tools for analyzing blood tissue or neurological function were primitive by modern standards. A boy who simply did not become ill, who recovered quickly from cuts and bruises, could not be placed neatly in any known category. Physicians were trained to diagnose ailments, not to explain an abundance of health. The absence of disease was not in itself a medical condition, and so they recorded their notes, shrugged at their own limits, and moved on. Not all inquiries came from medical men. A professor of natural philosophy at a small college wrote to Jonathan, asking if Timothy might be tested for extraordinary sensitivities to sound and light, proposing a series of experiments involving tuning forks, candlelight, and the detection of scents. Jonathan never answered the letter. A journalist from a regional paper arrived without warning, hoping to write a human interest story, but left empty-handed when Margaret refused to let him speak to the boy. The Caldwells' refusals were not born from fear of what might be found, but from an awareness that every examination, every article, every new story risked making Timothy less a person and more a curiosity. As the years passed, the boundary between respectful scientific interest and morbid fascination became increasingly blurred. Some who sought Timothy's time came with genuine questions, eager to expand the boundaries of knowledge. Others seemed motivated by spectacle, eager to claim they had seen the boy that science could not explain, as if he were a traveling exhibit. Jonathan took care to distinguish between the two, though in truth he allowed very few to see Timothy at all. Each refusal, however, carried the same effect. It preserved the mystery rather than dispelling it. To those on the outside, the lack of answers looked like proof that the answers must be extraordinary. There were moments when Jonathan wondered what might happen if they simply agreed to every test, every examination, every experiment. Perhaps, he thought, the accumulation of results, ordinary results, would finally convince people that his son was not the product of supernatural design, but merely a boy with good health and a touch of unusual resilience. But Margaret was less certain. She feared that each test would raise new questions rather than settle old ones, that the hunger for explanation would never be satisfied. She had seen enough of people's curiosity to know it was rarely sated by a single answer. The scientific minds who did meet Timothy often left with a similar expression, a mixture of admiration and quiet frustration. They could measure his reflexes, note his physical condition, even document his sensory abilities, but they could not place him within the framework of existing knowledge. His case became, for some, a private reminder that even the most confident science had its boundaries. In letters exchanged between physicians, Timothy's name appeared occasionally, always with a tone of bemusement. "The Caldwell boy," one wrote, who remains as hale as ever, untouched by the ailments that find the rest of us. For Timothy himself, these encounters were both intriguing and wearying. He submitted to examinations when his parents allowed them, answering questions patiently, tolerating the prodding and measuring without complaint. But he sensed, even as a child, that the adults around him were not just checking his health. They were searching for something hidden, some explanation he did not possess. He had no answers to give them. To him, the way he felt, the way his body worked was simply normal. If others found it strange, that was their burden to carry, not his. By the time he reached his mid-teens, the visits from curious physicians and scholars had grown infrequent. Those who might have pursued the matter had turned their attention to other mysteries, perhaps recognizing that Timothy's case offered no clear path to discovery. Yet the absence of ongoing study did not diminish the story's hold on the community. The phrase, "the boy science couldn't explain," had already taken root, and it would linger long after the last doctor packed away his instruments. In the quiet spaces of rural life where stories age slowly and memories lasted decades, that label would follow Timothy, whether he sought it or not. In the end, the limits of science were not marked by what could be measured or cataloged, but by what could be understood in human terms. Timothy's existence reminded those who met him that not every truth fits neatly into the drawers and shelves of reason, that sometimes the boundaries of knowledge are as stubborn as the mysteries they seek to contain. Long after the first whispers had faded into the background noise of daily life, Timothy's story still lingered in the minds of those who had known him. The years carried him forward, past the age when a boy is considered remarkable simply for being a boy, into the time when a young man must make his way in the world. By then, the conversations had changed in tone. The wonder was still there, but it had been softened, aged into something more reflective. People would nod toward him in the street, their eyes saying, "There goes the one we still don't quite understand." For Timothy, that persistence of attention was something he neither sought nor rejected. He had grown used to existing in the overlap between the ordinary and the unusual. He worked alongside other men, shared in the same chores, felt the same exhaustion after a long day's labor. Yet even in the most mundane tasks, his quiet durability set him apart. He could swing a hammer longer without tiring, walk miles without complaint, recover from a strained muscle in half the time it took others. These were useful qualities, but they also kept alive the old refrain that there was something in him beyond what nature had given to others. Some neighbors spoke of him as if he were a living charm. When he helped raise a barn and no one was injured, a farmer remarked that Timothy's presence had surely kept misfortune away. If he passed by a home where illness had taken hold and the patient soon recovered, someone might mutter that the boy, now a man, had carried health with him like a candle carries light. These were not accusations, but tributes of a kind, and yet they carried the same undertone of separation. Praise, like suspicion, could set a person apart just as firmly. Timothy's parents saw this and understood that it would never entirely change. They had shielded him in his childhood, but now that he was grown, the task of navigating the mystery was his own. Jonathan, proud and practical, told him plainly one evening by the fire, "You'll live your life, son, as other men do, and they'll talk about you all the same. Don't waste yourself trying to make them stop. Let them talk, and keep your work honest." Margaret added her quieter wisdom, reminding him that people often need stories more than they need facts. "If you are their story," she said, "be a good one." That advice took root. Timothy never tried to already erase the curiosity surrounding him, but neither did he feed it. When asked about his health, he answered politely, without drama. When someone hinted at supernatural explanations, he smiled and said only, "I'm just myself." He did not deny what others thought they saw in him, but he never claimed it for his own. In this way, he became not a spectacle, but a presence, something steady and unchanging in a world where few things stayed the same. As decades passed, the scientific advances that might have explained Timothy's constitution came too late to study him in his youth. Theories changed, tools became more precise, and the boundaries of medical knowledge expanded far beyond what the physicians of his boyhood could have imagined. And yet, even in an age where blood could be examined under powerful microscopes and the workings of the human body mapped in exquisite detail, no one ever returned to study him with the same zeal. The opportunity, if it had ever truly existed, had slipped quietly away. This fact, more than any supernatural speculation, was what kept his story alive. There had been a moment in time, brief and irretrievable, when science could have taken hold of the mystery. It had not, and so the mystery remained untouched, wrapped in the fog of what-ifs. Those who had known him in his youth could still recall the physicians with their puzzled expressions, the questions asked and unanswered, the quiet refusals that preserved his privacy. Over the years, they told those memories to their children, who passed them to their own. And in each telling, the story shifted just enough to keep its shape, but not its exact truth. In these retellings, Timothy's feats sometimes grew larger than life. A man who had once seen him leap from a riverbank to a passing raft now claimed he had done it in the midst of a flood. A woman who remembered him, lifting a barrel of cider without help, now swore he had carried two. The details swelled, as details in old stories always do, but the heart of the matter remained. Timothy Caldwell had been a boy, and later a man, that science, for all its confidence, could not fully explain. The irony was that Timothy himself placed little weight on the question. He had no longing for an answer. Whatever set him apart was simply part of the air he breathed. His focus was on living, not on being understood. He tended his work, maintained his friendships, helped when he could, and asked for little in return. The mystery belonged to others. The life belonged to him. And yet, in quiet moments, he sometimes considered the odd thread that had run through his existence, not with anxiety, but with a kind of curiosity, wondering if perhaps everyone had something within them that defied explanation, though most never knew it. His case had simply been obvious enough for others to notice. Maybe, he thought, the real limit of science was not in failing to explain him, but in failing to see the strangeness that existed in everyone else. In the town where he had been born, new generations grew up hearing about him. Some knew him personally in his later years, others only by reputation. To the young, he was a living relic of an earlier time, a reminder that there had been days when the unknown walked among them without being locked away in a laboratory. To the old, he was proof that not every question demanded an answer. And so, the story settled into its final form, not as a riddle to be solved, but as a piece of the town's quiet folklore. There was comfort in knowing that even as science marched forward, conquering disease and mapping the stars, there were still pockets of the unexplainable. Timothy Caldwell was one such pocket, a still pool untouched by the rushing current of progress. He carried the mystery without being consumed by it, and in doing so, he left behind not a solution, but a legacy. The simple truth that some things can be lived with, but never fully understood. That, in the end, was all that needed to be said. If you've enjoyed this glimpse into Timothy Caldwell's strange, half-forgotten world, you'll love the rest of the mysteries waiting inside Bloodlore, where history, legend, and the unexplainable twist together in ways you won't see coming. Subscribe to Bloodlore today and step deeper into the shadows where truth is stranger than fiction.